Hi, welcome to AI for the Skeptical Scholar. I gave this presentation for the SOAS College of Social Sciences about 2 weeks ago, and I wound up hearing from a lot of friends and a lot of other people that they would be interested in actually watching this. So I'm uploading it to YouTube. I had thought about kind of going back and making it something slightly more general and doing some tweaks, but I realized that it would be better to just get it up and hopefully get feedback from those of you who watch it, and I hope that it winds up being useful. Um, so the presentation itself is about practical strategies for using LLM in research. So it is July 30th today. I presented this to the SOAS faculty on July 15th. Um, and just a little bit of, why I wound up presenting this and hopefully how it's going to be useful for you folks who are watching this. I wound up writing a paper with Dr. Yunnan Chen of ODI Global this spring that was called Greener on the Other Side. And it was looking at Chinese lending. And what we wound up doing is we wound up using LLMs to classify 18,000 loans to try to get a picture of like what did green lending look like, in terms of Belt and Road Initiative lending. And when we did this, there really wasn't, I looked because I was trying to figure out like, are there best practices for how to do this? Are there best practices of how to use LLMs in policy research? And what I found was that it was really pretty sparse. So what we tried to do was, do this analysis, but also publish, we published a detailed methodological note, that talks about how exactly we did this LLM based classification, and also publish our GitHub repo, where we did the analysis simply to start to build, clearly there can be a lot of improvements on this, but we wanted to sort of start to build a baseline that people could build off of, because we think that this can be a really useful tool for research. And I think that one of the things that was really interesting to me and that really opened my eyes to the possibilities here was simply in the process of doing this. Traditionally, when you have large scale classification of this sort, a lot of it's done by research analysts, who are undergraduate research analysts, 18 to 22 years old, getting paid, let's just call it $15 an hour. And so if you do the back of the napkin envelope here, if you say that it would have taken each research analyst 5 minutes to do each classification, it would have taken 1,500 hours for them to do the whole thing, which is basically 2 months. And it would have cost about $22,500 if you just assume that you're paying them $15 an hour. And for what we were doing, it took us 15 hours and it cost $1.58 in API costs. So a lot of what I'm trying to do here is really start to share practical lessons that we learned in the process of this, and then in other work that I've been doing, and hopefully started a dialogue. I don't think anybody is an expert in this because it's very new, but I use it a lot. So let me try to teach you what I know so far. And I think that the key thing here is, I think going into this, and this is just, a preview of kind of what we were able to do, is we were able to actually quantify, is there a green BRI? There was a lot of policy talk that started talking about a green BRI and small is beautiful, and, talking about, solar and all sorts of things like that. You can read a lot more about the details in the paper itself. But, we were able to, in a sort of credible way, be able to classify projects and figure out sort of like, has we seen an increase in green lending, at least in the period of, where we have data? And the answer was no, we haven't. And we also were able to pull out a lot of other very policy relevant outcomes that help policymakers and other people, make decisions. And this is only possible because LLMs handled the routine classification, with a two-person team with a modest grant-funded budget, we weren't going to be able to do this otherwise. So it really enabled more ambitious research than we would have been able to do. So first of all, who am I? My name is Teal Emery. I am the founder of Teal Insights. It's a specialized consulting, research consulting firm. We work in a lot of areas related to sovereign debt and climate finance. And we also just build, so we advise countries on issues related to, climate investment and debt sustainability. And we have a mandate to build open source tools for finance ministries in developing countries. I'm a research consultant with Aid Data, where I work on lots of other issues related to Chinese debt and debt restructurings. I'm a fellow with the Energy for Growth Hub, and I teach at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And just in terms of things that I did before this that may be relevant, I spent 7 years on Wall Street as an emerging market sovereign debt analyst at Morgan Stanley Investment Management. In terms of what I do now and sort of the other part that I bring to this aside from the paper is, for Teal Insights, we're a small team distributed here in the US and Kenya and Nigeria. And, we want to do a lot. And so we use AI a lot, but it also matters, we're helping people form policy advice. And so actually making sure that things are responsibly done and reliable and are not AI hallucinations and whatever is of the utmost importance. So, I've had plenty of experience, both of what works and what doesn't, because we use it every day. And yeah. Um, and so here, just, and this goes back to the name of the presentation, AI for the Skeptical Scholar. I think in talking with colleagues and talking with other people, I think a lot of people have very mixed feelings about AI in general. Don't like oligarchs, don't really love, there are very serious issues that will happen with the labor market, and there's bias in the training data, that is going to get perpetuated in some of the outputs, hallucinations, which for those of you that don't know the terms of art, it's basically that AI can do a very good job of telling you very compellingly sounding things that actually happen to be false. Other ethical concerns like using content creators' work without their consent, and just missing context. So all of these things are real problems, and this workshop kind of acknowledges that those are the case, but also says, and we're not going to go over that. We have 2 hours here. But I think that the thing that I find is that you can think all of those things, but also think that LLMs can be a really powerful amplifier for good research. And I think it really democratizes research capacity, the ability of smaller teams of people to be able to do very ambitious research, is pretty amazing. And I think as much as anything is like it frees time for deep thinking. That's deep thinking is a very rare thing, and when you have to answer emails and you have to write things that are kind of BS formulaic things and whatever, it's hard to find that time that you need to really think deeply on topics, which is what it often takes to really make progress. And so I think that's one of the things that allows you to do, ironically, is AI can allow you to use your human self even better. And so trying to take the practical experience of what I have in terms of what works and doesn't work, and in a 2-hour time frame, be able to kind of give you a toolkit to start working, to really start out. I think just looking at this in 2 hours, like, you can't learn everything. So we're trying to shave off something that's going to be manageable and bite-sized, but is going to give you tools that are going to allow you to get started and really, in 2 hours time, be able to use these tools in a much more informed way. Part of what we're trying to do is give you a mental model of how to think about working with AI, and then some of the practical tools that you need to get started to do it in a responsible and good way. So three cumulative tools that we're going to build today in this workshop is going to be taking professional context, and that's going to help make the answers. The more you give the LLM, uh, in terms of information about yourself and what you like, the better your answers are going to be. And it's very easy to do. So we're gonna do that here. Enhanced prompting, basically like how can you prompt better to get better answers, and then reusable literature review tool. And each of these is meant to build on the last one. And so yeah, we're going to build a mental model first, just to think about like how this works and how to think about when to use AI and in what way and what not to do with it. Then we're going to build the three cumulative tools, and then we're going to talk about in the last part we'll talk about scaling up, and about like how you can use this kind of in ways like we did in the paper, to do sort of large scale analysis as well. Um, so for this, I also built a reference book. I built both of these in Quarto, which is a really cool, pretty easy to use publishing platform that I personally use in R. You can use it in Python or R or in Julia and Observable as well. And so if you go to this link, you can get all of these fine chapters is here. And I think the whole purpose here, particularly for the for the training, is that like this is already going to be a long training. It'll be approximately 2 hours long, though. And this is going to be able, this way you can go back and sort of look at particular parts, and there's going to be a lot more detail here than there are in the slides. I'll try to post the URLs for these, in the notes or whatever for YouTube. As you can probably tell, I'm not a YouTuber, and I've given up on attempts to try to make this particularly polished in that sense, but hopefully it's useful, which I think is more important than high production values. So yeah, please feel free to go through it. I think the idea is basically that you can then go through it in depth at your own pace there. Okay, so the mental model. We want to think about like how do you think about working with AI? And I guess here in part, this presentation was first given for academics. I am not an academic. I have a master's in international finance and economic policy, but I'm very much on the practitioner side, even if I do teach as well. I also hope that this presentation, as it's given, while it's meant for scholars, please interpret that very broadly. If you're a student, if you're somebody who in your work is a researcher in some capacity, or if you're just a very curious person, like that's what we mean here, and all of these things should be transferable to you as well. And the same thing is true kind of in all of these cases, is that there's a reality is that information overload is very real. There are too many papers to read. There's a lot of stuff that is in different disciplines that is impossible to understand because of the jargon that they use. There's a lot of really interesting stuff that's in other languages. And there's routine tasks, that eat up your research time, responding to emails, putting together status updates, doing all of this other stuff takes just stupid amounts of time oftentimes. And if you can knock that out of the way, you'll be able to do more interesting stuff and spend more time on the things that matter. So just to preface kind of how we're going to look at AI tools today here in this workshop, um, there's really sort of two broad ways of working with LLMs, and I'll use AI and LLMs, mostly interchangeably, though they're, for the detail oriented, there are slightly, differences there. So the first are web interfaces, and that's going to be our main focus for today. So browser-based, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, doesn't require any knowledge of coding or anything of that sort, and they generally sort of default to interactive conversations. And they're best for exploration or individual tasks. And then there are APIs, and if you don't know what an API is, then perhaps it's this is not what you want to be using right at this moment, but it's an application programming interface, I believe. And it's the way that you deal with LLMs programmatically through R or Python. And it allows you programmatic access. So this is what we used in doing the classification for the paper. It requires knowing, being a pretty decent coder, though I think the tooling is becoming much better. And so I think the sort of barriers to entry are becoming lower, and it allows you to have automated workflows. And it's best for large scale projects. So we're going to mostly cover web interfaces because those I think are going to be the most immediately useful for most of you who are assuming probably are not, we're not assuming any sort of particular coding knowledge for this, and we're assuming that maybe you've, touched some of these, LLMs before, but that you're not an expert. And then at the end, we'll look a little bit, in a more narrative fashion about sort of how APIs enabled our China project, and kind of how hopefully that can be helpful to you if you're thinking about scaling up your own research. So in terms of thinking about AI generally and working with AI, there's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania and plus obviously his co-authors, so I'd love to acknowledge as well, who's written a lot about AI and working with AI. He has a book called Co-Intelligence, which there's a lot of trash about AI, and I think that's actually a great book. And I personally learned a lot from it, and a lot of what I'm going to be talking about in this presentation is inspired by that. And what he talks about as a way to think, or he and his co-authors, who put out a working paper about this, talks about this idea of a jagged frontier. Is that basically the AI capabilities form an irregular and unpredictable boundary. So, this semicircle, I don't love this data visualization, but in a moment you'll see my own attempts to make a better one. This sort of shows like, here are things that are equally easy for us as human beings. And here are the capabilities of AI, this blue line. And there are certain tasks that are inside of the frontier, there are certain tasks that are outside of the frontier, and there's certain tasks that are on the frontier. And so if it's inside the frontier, that means that AI is much better at it. And sort of as a preface here, summarization of long documents, or better is maybe actually the wrong way to think about it. At least is either better or a lot faster. And we'll talk about this in a minute. And there are other things where they seem equally easy to us as human beings, but where like AI just is terrible at it. And there are things where you're equally in sort of good place, and you can use this general sort of idea to help triage, what sort of tasks you should be using AI for or not. And here's my personal favorite one is I would just absolutely love to make a better version of that jagged frontier data visualization. I'm a big data visualization nerd, and it really like the meaning of it doesn't come out at you easily. It takes explanation, and that means it's not necessarily a good one. I tried using ChatGPT, and I also tried using Gemini and some of the what do you call it, image generation models. And I tried for an hour. I uploaded the papers. I did all of this sort of prompting best practices. And at the end, it continued to be total garbage. Like this doesn't make any sense. And it has, weird, like, misspellings and strange things like this. It took me a long time. One prompt, 30 seconds, something like that. If you want to ask it to paint a dumpster fire in the style of Monet, or whatever your own equivalent is, it does a fantastic job, and I think this is the thing is in general, you just have to figure out for yourself exactly where this jagged frontier is for you, because as we say, is it's invisible and it's moving. And I think the final thing that Malik talks about a lot that I think is true is, whatever AI tools you're using today are the worst AI tools you'll ever use because it's getting better so much faster. I've been using them since ChatGPT, first became public, and then it was a little bit of a curiosity, and it was sort of helpful for certain things, but it was pretty bad at other things. And systematically, it's become much better at a lot of different things, and so every time a new model comes out, you kind of have to figure this out. And you also have to figure it out for your own context. You know what you know about, and you're the one that's going to have to figure this out. So you should make sure to start by asking it questions about places where you have a lot of domain expertise, and then you can start to figure out sort of exactly where does it get things right, where does it get things wrong, where does it make things up. um, so today we're gonna focus on two things that I think are very much the low hanging fruit. It's like we can't cover everything. There's a lot to do, and this is already gonna be a pretty long presentation. So we're trying to cover low hanging fruit here. So where is it that AI consistently saves researchers time? And the two places that I can think of that I use it all the time for are literature review tasks and coding tasks. Um, again, for both of these, you still need to use your human self to kind of go through these afterwards. But yeah. Okay, so collaborative. Think of AI as an infinitely patient research assistant. And so this is where you bring domain expertise in whatever you know about. You bring the research questions, you bring your quality judgment, your ethical frameworks, everything else. And what AI can provide is processing speed, just I think for literature reviews in particular, like, oh my goodness, pattern recognition, the ability to redraft quickly, and tireless consistency, which I guess it is a little bit stochastic, so there is some randomness. So I maybe don't want to overemphasize that, but that's there. And I think the whole idea here isn't, a lot of you who are watching this might teach in some capacity, and you've seen total garbage that your students have turned in. I know I have. um, eh, and that's the thing is you can't just outsource things to AI, but you can use AI to amplify your expertise, not to replace it. And that's what we're trying to do today. So for this particular workshop, decided to use Gemini. So I think in general there are three major labs: OpenAI, OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google. There are other labs as well, but these are sort of the three frontier labs at this point. And frankly, I have paid subscriptions to all of them, and I would kind of recommend you at least try paid subscriptions to a number of them. If you have Google Workspace, you already have access to Gemini, and given that this is pointed towards researchers, again, broadly defined, whether you are a academic or other type of researcher or just curious person, there are a couple of things, between sort of these three providers where I thought that, if we were going to try to have everybody at least try one out, that Gemini would be the right one. And the reason why is the context window. Context window is basically like, how much can you put in there? And in this case in particular, because we're going to be loading in tons of papers, it matters a lot. For Gemini, you can put in, it has a million token context window, which is, let's call it approximately 715 or 750,000 words or 15 papers. And that's 5 times as much as Claude or ChatGPT. I personally use Claude the most. I really like it, but a lot of times I wind up using Gemini partially just because you can upload just absolutely enormous documents in there, which is incredibly helpful. And then the other part for academic work, but also for any sort of work where you really want to be able to go back to the base source, uh, and is that Gemini winds up having in-text citation. So if you upload something and it's then taking something from there, it will say this came from this document on this page, which can be really helpful, and we'll look at that a little bit later. Um, okay. Um, so what makes AI different? Traditional software has predictable rules and consistent outputs, um, and LLMs are more like a knowledgeable but quirky colleague, which means they sometimes have brilliant insights, sometimes have confident nonsense. So this is the hallucinations that we talk about. They always need to be verified. Um, and your success with them is really going to depend on how well you're able to communicate. So for this is the reason why prompting matters. It matters, that you communicate clearly and effectively with the LLM. Okay, so what do we know now? We've started to go from theory to practice. We've built a mental model of this jagged frontier. We've talked about certain sorts of low-hanging fruit of where AI excels and why collaboration, why you should think of it as a collaborative tool, as opposed to something to outsource things to. And then also the tool options. So now we're going to start building our toolkit with these 3 cumulative tools. Um, why prompting matters. So, a couple of years ago, like when ChatGPT was first released, I think there were all sorts of news articles about people that were prompt engineers and however, that was going to become the job title of the future. And I don't think that's really the case. I actually don't think prompting is rocket science, anymore. As the models get better and better, um, they are, it becomes a lot easier to do this. But I think that the most important thing to remember is that LLMs are very powerful, but they're not clairvoyant. They can't really like guess what you're thinking, and they can't guess what you already know, and they can't guess how you want to be communicated to. And so what they need is they need to know who you are and what you're working on. They need clear instructions about specific tasks, not just vague requests, and the output format that you want it to come in. What sort of results do you want from them? And then any sorts of quality control. You need to have quality controls of ways to assess the accuracy of what you're receiving. And so it's like briefing a research assistant who's brilliant but knows nothing about your work. That's a nice way of thinking about it. Um, so the anatomy of effective prompts. Okay, so context, background information, your expertise, project details, task, specific requests with clear action verbs, format, structure, length, and style preferences. Constraints, what to avoid, limitations, requirements. Quality controls, ask clarifying questions or tell me when you're unsure. So let me just go through this briefly here. So yeah, you wanna tell it what you want it to do. It's not going to do it unless you tell it what to do. Pretty clear, and what is the format that you want? What are you trying to do? You're trying to respond to an annoying colleague. Um, are you trying to fix your garage door, which I can tell you I've done with AI tools, 'cause I'm pretty helpless otherwise. Constraints, I find for writing, LLMs by their nature use totally cheesy business speak. They're like ultimate effective synergy, whatever. And, so I always try to tell it to not use those, effusive adjectives. Um, and then the final part, these quality controls. These two things are really simple, but I find them to be remarkably helpful. So ask clarifying questions is really helpful because it does exactly that. It is going to ask you, instead of guessing your intention on something, it's going to ask you, and you have a chance to, give it more information that's going to help you get a better answer. And tell me when you're unsure is great because, again, they're sort of like very eager research assistants. And sometimes, this goes back to the hallucination thing. And I don't think putting, a magical 4 words is going to stop all hallucinations, but, they want to please you. And, if you tell them to tell you when they're unsure, then you're going to be, much clearer about, where it actually has confidence in what it's saying and what it doesn't. Um, so tool number 1 that we're building right now is professional context. Okay, so starting from, instead of, the challenge and one of the things I think for a lot of people, if you're starting to use LLMs a lot for work, for research, is that every time you get to your ChatGPT interface and you're starting from scratch every time. So here, this is where we can use professional context that captures your expertise and your background, your research focus areas, communication style, methodological preferences. If you do a lot of coding, your coding preferences, and you put this into a prompt and you save it somewhere that you like to save it. I save mine in Notion because that's what I use for these sorts of things. You could have a Google Doc, a Word doc, whatever you want. And it's going to be the future for all of our other interactions. And I think this one single step, it's not that hard to do. It's not rocket science, but it's going to get you much better answers because it's going to basically allow you not to have to repeat yourself and, to basically allow the LLMs to, know who you are and what you want. So for the activity here, I want you to go to gemini.google.com. If you want to do this in ChatGPT, you want to do this in, you want to do this in Claude, go ahead. It'll be totally fine. While all of this is sort of oriented towards Gemini, like you can do it in any of them. Upload your CV, bio, LinkedIn profile, and then use this prompt. Analyze my professional background and create a 200 to 300 word professional context for AI interactions, including domain expertise and background, current roles and affiliations, research focus and areas, communication style and audience, technical approaches I use, make it professional but conversational. And here is just a note for people following along. First of all, just feel free to just like pause the YouTube video here and take your time doing this. I allotted 8 minutes during the actual live presentation. And the other is that the nice thing about Quarto as a publication thing is that you can just click on this right here and it will copy it and you can just put this into your, into your, here, say, hey, okay. And I'm going to upload a file here. So what I have here is just, I downloaded a PDF version of my, LinkedIn details. You could use your CV, you can use anything else you want. So give that a try. And then I'm also going to say, I really like but professional tone that minimizes jargon, except where necessary, and uses plain language to explain complicated topics. Um, yeah, so give this a try and do this. Um, yeah, so this is sort of a version of it for me, and just looking over it pretty quickly, like it looks pretty decent as a first shot, and so like if you don't like what it says originally or you don't think it's good, then just, say, hey, but it would be great. You can also emphasize my passion for circus performance. I don't know. Make something up. Whatever you want. So, you can just play around with it and figure something out that looks good. I am going to just show you, this is the one that I actually use, that winds up then being part of this. And it doesn't look that much different. It then says, here's what my, current roles are right now. Here's my general technical approach, including the fact I have very specific things I want when I code in R, my current focus, and my communication style. So I spent a little bit of time doing this, and so I'd say, for right now, you don't have to make it perfect. I would just start to make it good enough to, be able to do the rest of this, and then you can go back and iterate and make it better, and figure out what works. And I think the deal is you want it to be detailed enough, but you don't want it to be like 17 pages long. You want it to be a couple of paragraphs. Um, so yeah, I think feel free to just pause the YouTube and do this exercise until you feel like you have something that is good enough for today. And again, just continue to make it better. If it's not communicating in a way that you like, if there's something that you're like persistently find it annoying when it uses particular phrasings or something like that, then stick that in there. Um, so what have you built now? You've now built professional context that's going to introduce you to any AI system. So again, keep this in some place that's make a folder, do whatever system you wind up using. Like I said, I wind up using Notion for this, but you can use text files, you can use Google Docs, you can use whatever you want, and it's going to allow you to capture your unique expertise, set appropriate communication style, and eliminate repetitive explanations. And so we're going to use this for pretty much all of the other prompts and all of the other tools that we're building here. Okay, tool 2, enhanced prompting. We combine context with structured requests. So without structure, say, hey, help with a literature review, and if you have a vague request, you're going to get a very generic output, but if you put the context of like, okay, what is it exactly that you're trying to do? What is the task that you want the LLM to do? And what is the format that you want it to put it in? Then you're going to get much more useful output. And this is really, this is a lot of magic, and this is where I think it's great. And the reason why I created this is because, like, really, none of this is that complicated, but it's really effective. And that's great. The context plus the clear structure is going to really give you targeted assistance here. Um, and So we talked about this a little bit before, which is this ask clarifying questions. I highly emphasize this is going to be, quite useful for you, and to ask it to tell you when it's unsure. Um, okay, so activity two, enhanced prompting. Um, okay, professional context from activity one. So paste in what you got from activity one, and then say I'm working on a specific um, research, whatever. Please help me. What do you want it to do? How should it be formatted? And any constraints? Ask me clarifying questions if you need anything. Tell me when you're unsure about something. Um, okay, so 10, approximately 10 minutes for this. So, I'll do a really simple sort of version of this right now. Um, and, um, you know, you can just pause the YouTube, spend a bit of time doing this, or you can do it later or whatever you want. Um, okay, let me do a new chat here. So what I'm going to do is I will go here and I am just going to copy my professional context. I'm going to go back into Gemini. Um, so I'm going to say, about me, Teal Emery. And let me go back here, and I'm going to copy and paste this. Okay. Um, and so I am going to do something here that I hope is, going to be helpful to you. So I have to learn about data models and about uh, statistical data metadata exchange. And I don't know about that. Like that's not my background. My background is about, sovereign debt and investment and, other things of that sort. And I want to understand what this means, but I really don't know. So, and it's 171 pages long, and it's really, really, beautiful prose, as I'm sure you can see. So, um, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I'm going to just drag this in here. I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to say, I want you to help me gain an intuitive understanding of the SDMX data model. I am not a, I have very little domain expertise about data models or anything like this, so I need it, or actually, I'll put that as a constraint. Um, um, so I need it um, translated into language and concepts I can understand as person that works with a lot of macroeconomic data, knows very little about data concepts. More than 500 words. Structured explanation, bold plus bullet points. Let's call it 800 words. And which one of those is which part of this? As you can see, that oh, and I totally forgot to put my personal context here, but you should put that up top. Just copy and paste it there. So Gemini 2.5 Pro. So I think first of all, everything in this that's talking about specific tools, like this is going to be outdated like immediately. So I wouldn't worry so much about specific ones. But Gemini 2.5 Pro and beyond are pretty good models. That before Google was a bit behind. So yeah, it gave me what I wanted. I think if I'd have actually put in the my professional context like I have put in the assignment, it would give it to me a even better way. But it gave me sort of a useful explanation here. So figure out something for yourself that you want to try and do it. I'd say like, look, this webinar is meant to talk about sort of research topics, but like, I know a lot about, and I think this will probably be true for a lot of the other people watching. I know a whole lot about things that are about like this wide, and I'm an expert in it. But like anything outside of that, I'm can be pretty clueless. And so like my dishwasher broke yesterday. I used it. It worked really well. I hate responding to emails that have like multiple people and lots of questions and threads. Use that too. There's a lot, and I'd say that the prompting chapter in the companion book has a lot more sort of examples of things that you can do, but also just get creative, try it out, and also you can also use LLMs to like help build your prompts and improve your prompts. Okay, so the compounding effect, and please ignore the fact that I totally forgot to put in my professional context here. But you get what you've discovered now is that you're able to get not just generic responses, but much more clear responses with the structure that you need. Quality controls, are going to reduce your errors, and now you have an LLM that actually understands what your research needs are, and that's really helpful. And it's a little it's not difficult, but it's not necessarily intuitive, because I think a lot of us are used to using Google, for the last however many years as the way to, and search, and the way that you get good answers, with LLMs is different. And so this is just trying to hopefully give you guys a leg up on learning that. Okay, and the next thing we're going to do is deal with the biggest time sink, which is literature review. The problem is very clear. I think, again, it's like whether you are an academic or whether you're a researcher or just purely curious person, whatever it may be, that there's an explosion of publications. It's like I look at LinkedIn, however, dull and boring LinkedIn is. And, but there are people I know that write really cool stuff. And I'm like, wow, I really want to read that. But it's like 100 pages. And I also like, want to like spend time with my family and like, hang out with my dog, and like have a social life. You want to read things in other languages. Like I speak two languages or one language and another language. Okay. There are a lot of other things that are in other languages that I can't read. That it's pretty amazing that I can get pretty good understanding of. And then insights trapped in other disciplines. I think in particular, I think jargon is efficient. So within disciplines, like jargon allows people to speak clearly to each other without explaining complex topics. And that's great, but it can make it really hard for anybody that's outside of that discipline or subdiscipline to understand what they're saying. It sounds a little Charlie Brownish sometimes, like wah, 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 wah. And there's just not any time to read everything. So this is where there's low-hanging fruit that I think is really pretty incredible. So here's my personal workflow. And I'm actually going to say that this is lying because mine is even more simple than this, but more or less like this. Is first of all, like put your personal context in and then say, okay, please provide the full citation information at the top of the document, and then create a detailed, structured summary of this entire document, including any appendices. Just because I've learned if you don't do that, it'll sometimes only do the main document. I need to understand the main argument or purpose, key findings or conclusions, important data, evidence, or examples, any policy implications or practical applications, who is the intended audience appears to be. Format this as a structured summary with clear headings. And the result is like, okay, there are hundreds and sometimes thousands of pages of papers that like, come across my proverbial desk each week, and I don't have time to read all of that. And what I found is that this is a really great funnel, because I can get 90%, of the meaning. I can figure out like, do I actually want to know this? Do I just need to know sort of what they found out, how they did it, a lot of this other stuff. So I'd say that like, for probably 95% of what comes across, like that summary is sufficient. And for other things where, I really do want to do the deep reading, it allows me to really focus on the parts that matter for what I'm doing, and also just focus on the papers. No more reading crappy papers. And I actually also wind up doing something where I say afterwards as a follow-up thing, okay, what is the, if you start with this and then you basically say, okay, please summarize each section of the paper, because a lot of the things I read are IMF reports, things from think tanks, other stuff like this. And, then oftentimes I'm trying to look for like, what are their data sources? What do they do? And that you can then figure out like, okay, it's actually in chapter 2. This has a whole section here where they discuss the literature and they show their data sources and how they deal with it. And, it may be that it's a 200-page document and I really only need 10 pages that are in chapter 5. Like, so I found this to be incredibly helpful and efficient at letting me know like where should I actually use my like human attention, doing this. And so then there's just kind of as a related thing, there are two translation superpowers that LLMs have. So one is about language translation. For the ODI paper, on Chinese lending that I wrote, I was looking through lots of, Chinese policy documents and other things like this. And I don't speak Mandarin. My co-author does, and so I was able to look through them and get sort of like what the clear meaning is. Obviously, as with anything here, if something winds up being like a very key subtle point that's key to your decision, like you should probably take further action. It's like if it's ask somebody that is a native speaker, to double check with it or whatever it is. But in terms of being able to really expand the scope of your research and the ambition of sort of like how big is the initial part of the funnel, like it can be real big now. And it can be more ambitious than before. And I think and the second part is jargon translation. Again, jargon is kind of a necessary evil with specialization. It gives us specialized language to talk about things, but it also makes it like impossible to read for people outside of those specializations. And a lot of the work that I work on, I am dealing with computer science things more and more, and that is not my background. So being able to use an LLM to ask questions, say of like that SDMX, data model document or other things like this is incredible because like I just wouldn't necessarily be able to understand it that well without that, and then economics and a wide variety of other things. And also just trying to figure out like sometimes it can be hard if you yourself are an expert. One of the ways that you can do this is like there's a curse of expertise where you're like, oh, it's easy, and then you're like blah 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 blah. At least to the stakeholders that you're trying to communicate to, they're like, I don't understand any of that. So you can use LLMs to help translate to them. So that's another side here. That I think both of these are really great, and that there's so much hiding in plain sight, that are things that are outside of our silos, outside of the things that we would initially be thinking about in terms of, our whatever our particular domain specialization is, or that's in a different language, and so I think I found it to be, super helpful. Yeah, and so here's a cross-disciplinary example. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I invite you to, stop the YouTube and try any of these out. This is a computer science paper. It uses unfamiliar terminology. Identify the main contributions in plain language. Identify how their methods might apply to social science research or whatever your context is. Highlight any useful techniques for your research area. Focus on practical applications, not technical details. Okay, so here we come to the third part. So gems, and gems are just what these things are called in Google Gemini. In Claude, they're called Claude projects. In ChatGPT, they're called custom GPTs. You can look up the directions for doing this for any of those. And that basically they're saved AI configurations with your instructions. So, they're reusable across conversations, no need to re-enter context, and they're continuously improvable. So just think about it as like a specialized research assistant who remembers all of your preferences. And this can be incredibly useful both for yourself, but also if you work with a research group or if you work in a company or you work in some other thing and you want to have a sort of standardized way that you look at documents or do some sort of thing. Like you can create a prompt once and, use it over and over again to do a process. So build a literature review gem. Okay, so first upload a paper, apply context plus your, literature prompt, identify what you want to improve, and then create a gem. Combine all of your learning, save it as a reusable tool, test it on a new paper. Combines everything you've learned. So this is basically like take the context from part one, take this refined, refined, uh, you know, refined kind of ask from part two, and then apply it, in something that's going to be reusable. So let's go here to Gemini and the way that you do this, and you can see I actually used one of these gems to make this presentation. And then I also have one, and I'll just show this right now quickly. I have one that is for, that is my overall, why is it? Hold on. Um, Somehow it won't let me edit mine. But mine basically, like, I would say this one that I have right here, it literally just has all of this stuff in here, in there. So it's kind of like, if I'm just doing things, it says like, who am I? So I would do that. I mean, that's a really great basic one to do. It's just, whatever your personal context is, put it in there. Oh, here I can find them. Yeah. So exactly, you can see right here that literally I just copied and pasted all of this other stuff in there. One thing that is just a minor note and doesn't actually matter that much. So if this doesn't make sense to you, please don't spend time thinking about it. Is for whatever reason LLMs like Markdown, which is where this single pound sign makes it a level one heading like you see there, and a double pound sign makes it a level two heading. Um, you know, that that is the case. It doesn't matter that much. Um, so, okay, let's just go back here. And yeah, you can also see, what I wound up doing for this. I'm not going to go through and do the entire thing, but I think that what you'll find is that these can be remarkably helpful. And like I said, I use Claude a lot more than I use Gemini. So in Claude, I have a ton of Claude projects, and I try to be good. I think if any of you do program in any way, shape, or form, you're familiar with the idea of dry, the don't repeat yourself, and essentially the sort of uh, the words of wisdom there for coding are like, if you do keep doing the same thing more than like one or three times, you should probably build a function. And I think the same winds up being true here. So I'm not going to go through and build this for you because I think if we don't take 25 minutes with this will be a nice shorter thing. But I would recommend that you give this a try and figure out, and I think here the things to think about are like, what do you usually read, and you may want to have slightly different ones. I read a really wide variety of documents, and so and so for me it looks a little bit different, because I think if you read all academic articles and in your specific field, they have a very specific form and things that you're reading the paper for. You should put that in your prompt, and if you can have a specific one for specific types of papers and another one for more general things. I keep mine more general because I wind up reading government documents, academic papers, all sorts of other stuff. And they have quite varying forms. So if I made it too specific, it would be a little bit counterproductive. But I do think that one of the things I would show you is just like, okay, so here's one of the ways that I do this. And again, this is in Notion, is where I keep a lot of my stuff is upload. I have members of my team, we've built these together, and so if you have research assistants or if you have an associate that works for you, if you have somebody else, like you can help craft the gem or Google project or custom GPT to do this and have them do this for you. So I have one of the members of my team do this, and we upload the documents, and so you can go through it all here, but here, and this is looking at one of the IMF's models, for looking at the it's looking at debt investment and growth and natural disasters, to basically model, key macroeconomic things and sort of the choice between resilient and non-resilient infrastructure. So I start out, this is where I said I was actually lying about that prompt before, because I actually use something that's even more simple that basically says, please provide me with a detailed structured summary of this report, including any appendices. And so it gives me a detailed structured summary of this report. And then I do the second thing where I say, hey, can you give me a detailed structured summary of each section of this report? And here I know, exactly what's in each section, and so for me, I can figure out like, what do I need to figure out? Do I need to understand the alignment model or module? Well, I should probably go to chapter 5, and then it's the first part, or parameter calibration. So it can be pretty helpful. And basically, like, so any document that kind of comes in, my team puts it on here using these custom prompts, and all of a sudden, when you're starting to look at this, you're not starting from zero. You're starting from, something that's that gives you a pretty good understanding of what's in the paper. So I know whether I need to actually go in here and look at something detailed or whether this gives me enough. And I think that kind of, I don't know, meta part is then, for Notion, for lots of other things, they then have their own AI summary. So it gives me this, okay, the DigNAD toolkit provides a framework for assessing macro fiscal impacts of natural disasters and infrastructure investments in low-income countries, featuring modules for scenario analysis, parameter calibration, and sensitivity testing to enhance public investment efficiency and disaster resilience. So, what this means is for us, the way that we wind up using this is, we're working on projects right now, and we have tons of tons and tons of different documents that are coming in, and it allows us to then, in very easy sort of way, be able to see all of this stuff without doing it manually, which then allows us to spend our time on the parts that like actually matter. And so it increases efficiency, and it increases the ambition of the types of projects we're able to take on. So I'm going to let you guys pause for as long as you need to make something useful. I think that really, obviously, like having a literature review gem, this is the idea of putting this into this workshop is that this is truly, I think, an area of very low hanging fruit, but like do whatever you want. But I think that the whole point is like try making something where you make a reusable template that you can use anytime, so that when you have something that you wind up doing in an LLM all the time, that you can just get started immediately. Okay. So cumulatively, like what have we built so far? So in the first tool, we built your context. We took your information and helped AI understand who you are and how you like to be communicated to and what you usually do. In the second tool, we created some structure, to help you figure out, clear, useful outputs, things that are actually going to answer the questions you're trying to answer. And then finally, we created a gem, which again could also be a Claude project or custom GPT or whatever else you want to use, which is a reusable tool. And again, I think that the final part for all of these is like it's all iterative. Like if you don't like what it's giving you, then iterate on it. If it's still giving you crappy answers in some way, like see if you can play around with it and make it a little bit better. But each of these elements reinforces the last part, And now you have a tool that you can start to use, and these are things that you can continue to do. And I think again, it's like I'm aware that everything in terms of the specific tools that I put here are going to be, um, you know, outdated immediately. But I'm hoping that this ages well enough because I think that these sorts of principles are going to be around, even as the specific tools that we wind up using wind up becoming, hopefully better and better. Um, So now we're going to move on from literature to coding. Literature review and basically dealing um, with long, boring documents is sort of low-hanging fruit number one, and coding assistance is low-hanging fruit number two. And so for me, it's like I'm a really big nerd, so like this is kind of the reason why I do this stuff anyways. And so honestly, like this whole having a toolkit for long, boring documents has been like a dream of mine since before I knew AI was a thing. Um, and coding assistance, like, I think in general, it's amazing. I think for any of us that do a lot of coding, oftentimes we spend a lot of time on Stack Overflow in the past, and it's so much better now. But it's not a panacea. So I think let's talk a little bit about this. So first of all, if you don't use coding at all and you're not interested, then skip this portion. But I think a lot of researchers, use R, Python, Stata, SPSS, other things like that. Or maybe you don't, but you supervise people that do. Or maybe you're an Excel user that wants to start using reproducible workflows. And I think that the real opportunity is to use AI as an infinitely patient coding tutor and assistant. I think we're still a long way from it just doing everything for you and actually doing that well. Though I would say I'm astounded at sort of how fast the improvements have been. So, maybe I'm wrong. Um, so the coding jagged jagged frontier. So going back to our mental model, it's like, okay, it's really good at some things and it's not so good at other things. And I think you have to figure that out for yourself, and also just based on your own coding abilities. If you're a really good coder, if you're not a good coder, etc. Um, but I think that there are places where it's really awesome. Like I use R and Python, but probably mostly R for doing data analysis. And I guess this is probably also a good place. Like I don't think that we're at the end of coding yet. And that actually still at this point, if you're a data, I guess I would consider myself a data analyst. Um, you know, I try to make sense out of dirty data. That's a lot of what my work winds up being. And it's remarkably helpful for a lot of these things. And I think can again increase your ambition. Um, but it also has downsides. So I think that's in this sort of sense. It doesn't know your specific data quirks. It oftentimes doesn't do understand how to build sort of the entire architecture, and you can kind of wind up building a spaghetti bowl of of code. Um, and yeah, you'll need to figure these things out for yourself. So here, sort of the promise and the peril. So the promise is that it can be 10 times faster for routine things, and it can allow you to learn new languages quickly, uh, create better documentation. Like, before it used to be such a pain. I create R packages, before it used to be such a pain in the butt to like write these out, and so people did a bad job of it. And now you can write, you know, documentation much better, much more quickly, and also things like unit tests. Which again, if you don't know what a unit test is, don't worry. But like, they're really helpful, and they're also just a pain in the ass to do. So using AI to do that is amazing. Um, but I think there are still perils, and I think one is that there's a peril of vibe coding. I teach real world data analysis as part of the course that I teach at SAIS, and I think um, as I've talked to younger people, a lot of them are like, you don't need to learn how to code because you can just vibe code now. You can just ask, ChatGPT or Claude or whatever. Um, but there are a lot of limits to it, and a lot of times it can look right and it can run wrong. So, there's real problems. There's hallucinated functions, other things like this. And I'd say also just a general sort of sense of what I've heard other people call the 0 to 90% problem, which is that like sometimes I wind up using AI to try to solve some sort of problem. And, in the first go, I go from, 0 to 90% of the problem solved. And then solving that last 10% is just a total pain in the ass. And sometimes I realize that like I actually would have been better off just coding it myself, uh, without it. And I think also just like don't have overconfidence in your output. If you still need to understand your code, and you need to validate your results. So I think those are sort of the big picture things here. Um, yeah, and so for vibe coding, whether you're vibe coding or you're, um, supervising somebody that's giving you output that is vibe coded, like you need to validate it. You need to make sure that you try it with data that you understand. Make sure that you can verify the calculations that are being done in some sort of way that you feel comfortable with. Check package documentation, etc. Um, so just in terms of best practices, the better models are better. And so I think this is true in general. Is like, look, I've tried using the like local open source models, and I really like conceptually like the idea of running it on my local computer and not having all of my data go to these big companies, et cetera. But they're not that good. Or at least the ones that you can run locally, and the bigger the model, the better they are at coding, and the better they are at a lot of other things, that really there's a lot to that. So, pay the extra money. I'd say I pay for the super premium ones because for me it's worth every cent of it. But so I paid $200 a month for ChatGPT, whatever the fanciest plan is, because I use it and I employ other people, and I can tell you it's a good deal for me, and it might be for you too, but you need to figure that out for yourself. But I would say at a minimum, get the like, for most of these providers, they have sort of their first paid plans are at about $20 a month range, and give that a try. And I'd say that generally I've found, and a lot of other people have found, that Claude is the best for coding. Again, like I say, everything that I say here about specific, model abilities is going to be, you know, it will be, outdated immediately. So try it out for yourself. Provide complete context, so the data structures, the expected output. Um, Work iteratively. I think this is a key one, and this goes to that 0 to 90% thing that we talked about before. I think particularly some of the newer models, like they really like to what you would call zero shot, or they like to basically give you the entire complex code base like immediately, which it doesn't oftentimes, it oftentimes doesn't have enough context to actually know that that's solving everything that you need. So you wind up with a huge amount of code, and it becomes much more difficult to, debug and deal with. And so I'd say it's far better to sort of go step by step, when you're doing that. And then include your preferences. This is the same as your context in other places. And I have a separate, in Claude, I have a separate, uh, you know, context prompt and tool that basically, has who I am, all of that other stuff, except it has a lot more details about my coding preferences. So it's like I want to use the tidyverse style guide and I want to use the base R pipe, which again, if you don't understand what those are, it doesn't matter, but it gives me the code that I want. And you should always validate against known results or do something else that allows you to have comfort that it's correct. I won't go through in all sorts of detail here. I want to make sure that we keep this not so long. But I think you're going to want to give as much information as possible about about your data. So actually, I would say I would go even further than this. I would oftentimes just copy and paste. You can. Most of these newer models are what they call multimodal. So you can just take a screenshot of your data, that shows what it looks like and sort of some of these other things, or you can copy and paste it, in text form or something else like that. And yeah, and say how you like your how you like your answers and kind of everything else that we talked about as detailed prompting from before. And I'd say one of the things that's kind of in the same way that this ask me clarifying questions and please tell me you're unsure is helpful. Include comments explaining each step. Annotating your code and having it annotate each part of the code can be really helpful when you have it build things. And also, like if you wind up, say, with a script, like I'm trying to recreate the results for the World Bank's worldwide governance indicators, and they have a Stata script that they have there, and like I don't usually I haven't done Stata since I was in graduate school. I hate Stata. And so like it's pretty great because I can use an LLM to basically be like, can you please annotate everything that's happening here? And so it'll then give me the whole thing back and do this. And you can use the same sort of things that you use, for example, with the literature translation. So, and again, you'd want to do this part by part and other things and validate and all of these other things we've talked about, but you can use it to then, potentially translate, from Stata into R or into Python or, whatever your preference is. Advanced coding tools, we're not going to really go into this that much, but there are other things. In particular, I think Cursor winds up being the thing, so far what we were talking about is basically just using, the chat interface for, coding advice. But the other thing that can be helpful here is, Cursor has become remarkably popular, particularly with, with people that are software engineers. It is an AI native IDE, which if you don't know what that is, it's probably an IDE is a integrated development environment. But it's for people that are big nerds about this already. So, and that it has a number of things, it's using the same sort of models in the background, so you can use Claude or you can use, the OpenAI models, but it has things that I guess I would most, the best way to think of it is it makes it ergonomic, in terms of like, it just is an easier way to sort of deal with a lot of these things. It allows you to put different parts of your code base into context, and to edit kind of in place. It will suggest edits and you can either accept them or not. And I think honestly, like I haven't been using this yet. It's very high on my list to do, because I'm sold on the concept, but I'm also not an expert. So, I think, and if what I said here doesn't make sense, it's probably not something that you need to pay attention to at this moment. Okay, so let's just take a moment to look at what we've done so far. So we're going now from the tools to scaling. So far you've gotten a mental model, this idea of this jagged frontier and the fact that it's a quickly moving jagged frontier. It's invisible and you have to find where that frontier is for yourself, in the domains that matter to you. And then we've built these three practical tools where you have your context, you've learned to sharpen prompts, and then you've learned to make reusable prompts in the form of gems or projects or whatever. And you now understand sort of some of the low-hanging fruit of using AI, particularly in a web interface, which I'd say, text summarization and literature review and code are really helpful. So first of all, I think before I do the scaling up, I did this in the in the actual webinar, and I want to do it now. Is like there are just a couple other tools, and again, this part will be totally outdated quickly, but these are pretty amazing tools for the time being. So one is Notebook LM, and so this is one of the other reasons why I suggested Google Gemini for those people who are who are scholars or researchers. Is Google, you get something called Notebook LM, and if you have a what do you call it, a pro account, you can upload like 300 documents, and so for the China paper that I co-wrote, we were one portion of it is we were trying to understand this change from lending, overseas lending by the policy banks, so China Development Bank and China Exim Bank, towards the state-owned commercial banks, so like ICBC, Bank of China, China Construction Bank, and part of this we were trying to figure out, like, can we look at the financial statements and like figure things out from there. Like what are the sort of like juicy details that we could do? And so we looked at the financials and, sort of did financial statement analysis, and like, okay, we find out that like, all right, China Exim Bank has like a huge loss in 2017. And that's like that's pretty interesting. So basically wound up downloading a bunch of years of their annual reports and uploading them here. And each of them are like, I don't know, 150, 200 pages long, something like that, and they're really, really boring. I literally did read through, some of the more recent ones, like from start to finish. And it's like, it's not anyone's idea of fun, but also like they're really kind of hard to figure out. And so, the thing that's pretty great here is so now you have all of your sources. You can either select specific ones or you can select all of them. And so here, let me say, can you tell me about China Exim's 2017 losses? What caused them and how did they talk about them? Okay. So it'll take a little bit of time to search through everything, but not that much time. And then it's going to say, okay, in 2017, China Export Import Bank reported a net loss of, RMB, blah, 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 12.26 billion, and a pre-tax loss of blah, blah, blah. The primary cause of this was a significant foreign exchange loss. This loss was incurred due to an appreciation of the RMB against the US dollar. And so here, we're now going to click on this, and it's going to bring us to, it literally takes us to the part in that document. So this is the 2018, it's the annual report 2017 that was published in 2018. And it brings us exactly to the part of this that, does this. And it's pretty interesting. Okay, so it received a capital injection, and here is this sort of thing. And so instead of control, the way that we had to do this, and for me as a analyst in years past, is you downloaded a bunch of stuff and you control left it, and if you looked for the wrong thing, you wouldn't find it, and it just didn't work quite as well. And so here it gives you a remarkably good, um, a remarkably good summary, but it also then allows you to go back to these primary sources. And I think, whether you're an academic or anybody that really needs to worry about the idea that you're, actually doing the right thing, this matters a lot. Um, and yeah, and so then it allows you to either make this into a note, it'll make it into an audio overview, which like gives you like a couple minute like conversational podcast, which is like eerily good, at least in some of the experiences that I've had, or you can make a mind map, and some of this is like a little bit of a gimmicky whatever, but I think it can be quite useful. And I think in particular, if you're going through, a lot of documents and you want to be able to synthesize between documents, you want to be able to compare things, you want to be able to do these other things, and you have the need to go back, to actually check primary sources, this is something that really provides a workflow that I think of as being quite ergonomic for researchers, where you're able to use LLMs to, do the things that they're really good at, and sort of have an ability to do semantic search, where it knows the meaning of what you're saying and not just the fact that you use the right, exactly the right word. um, and summarization and all of this other stuff, but also with the ability to sort of go back and double check the first thing. So I wind up using this a lot. I think it's a great tool. Um, and another one, and this is where I use ChatGPT, and one of the reasons why I use the like fancier one, because at least at the beginning it was only available for the fancy subscription. I build open source tools, and I'm helping build something called the Econ Dataverse. And I wanted to learn, I was having interesting conversations with people with sort of computer science backgrounds that were telling me about, semantic web technologies and data ontology and things like that. And I was like, okay, how do I apply this to the things that I'm working on? Because like, I don't understand that stuff. It's, above my pay grade. In terms of that. So I wrote a bunch of things. I put in, I had given a presentation at the World Bank, sort of talking about our approach to building, tools, which I don't know if this doesn't load in a second, I won't show it to you. So that had a lot of context there. I put in lots of things, just chat, basically saying like, I have no background in all of this, so, I'm trying to build useful tools. And then at the end, I put in my professional context, and it then asked me some clarifying questions here. So it's like, okay, what are you trying to do? What are the scenarios for tool use? Like, and I'm trying to do a certain amount of work this summer. So it's like, okay, what's what's sort of the capacity there? And so I then go back through and answer some of those, and it thinks, and it spends 8 minutes thinking, and then it gives me this whole, report. And you can then, um, so yeah, it gives me this 16-page report that basically answers my questions, and I can tell you, did a remarkably good job. Um, I think like you have to, like everything else, be aware there are limitations to it. It only really has access at this point, for licensing reasons, not for technological reasons. It only really has access at this point to publicly available documents, until they sign. I'm sure they're all in a scramble to sign licensing deals. And it can be confidently wrong. There's all sorts of things. But I think, again, this is like, what if I paid somebody to do this? They could be wrong too. They could give me not what I wanted. And if I'd have asked one of my team to do this, like, I don't know, maybe they do this good of job, but I'd say I use this all the time. And I actually think that this is something. I'm getting ready to go on a trip to a country that I've never been to. And I use this to prepare for that, to basically be like, okay, what visas do I need? Do I need any vaccines? What's the best deal of getting from the airport to where I need to go? Et cetera, et cetera. What should I do when I have some free time? And I think these are sort of research capabilities that used to be possible when you were really rich or very powerful, and you had like a chief of staff and a staff that would do this stuff for you. And now you can do it for pretty cheap, which is the reason why I really have no hesitation paying extra for these sorts of things, because it's very helpful. I use it before big meetings. If I'm meeting with a bunch of people who have somewhat public profiles, I'll, basically just like paste in the invite list and the sort of like what we're supposed to talk about. And, it can give me interest, sort of bios of who the people are and what they've done related to what we're working on. And it's really remarkably helpful. It's like having a personal assistant. And then let me just show one other thing. I'm going to just go here, and I use Perplexity. So this is AI search, and now all of these things, everybody's getting into it. One person does it well, and then everybody else sort of copies it. So Google itself, like it's getting it's faced severe competition for the first time in a very long time. So now they have AI search. I've still found that Perplexity like works better than the other ones at this moment. So it's the one that I wind up using, and it's just really helpful because, like, okay, I do this. I'm in a meeting with somebody online, and you say like, who is this person? And you just like literally put their name in, and here it gives pictures of me as a slightly younger man, and some nice teal colored furniture as well. If maybe I'll buy this. And it does a pretty good job. I've looked through what it does for myself. You should look through it for yourself if you have any sort of web presence, or just for anything that you're interested in. And again, I think it can be it's very time saving. So for me, it's like it just saves me a bunch of time of like going through and doing it. And again, I think it has the same sort of ergonomic, what I'd like to think of as sort of an ergonomic workflow of like, I can then see exactly like where the answers come from. So it's, not just like you have to keep this as a, you don't just have to take it at its word. You can be like, okay, where, where did it get this? And so, yeah, those are tools that I find remarkably helpful. So with that, those are sort of advanced tools. Now let us go to scaling up. So web interfaces, from web interfaces to APIs. Okay, so what are we exploring now? How these tools enable ambitious research. So back to the paper that we wrote. There was just a lot of discussion about green belt and road. And also just, I think there was sort of a policy. There's a lot of things that when there's not great evidence, like, stories matter a lot. And there's an idea of, sort of overcapacity in solar and sort of new energy technologies and stuff like this, and, a stopping of coal infrastructure financing and all of this other sort of stuff. And so part of what we were trying to look at was like to kind of figure out, based on the empirical reality, which is obviously, not not perfect because the data sources are lagged and they're everything of this sort, all of the things. Um, but what do we know about China's role in funding the energy transition in developing countries? And this matters a lot because, like, the U.S. isn't doing it anymore, and there's all of the sort of climate finance that was promised as part of the Paris Agreement, and other sort of related forums, and it hasn't really been coming through. And private sector climate finance hasn't necessarily materialized as much as it should. And so I think there was a lot riding on, like, okay, maybe China's going to do it, which again, talk about that in a lot of different ways, but I was trying to figure out, like, okay, what can we see from the data, and that also, like, this comes in parallel with the time that we know that there's been this big transition from the policy banks to the state-owned commercial banks into co-financing. So figuring out, like, okay, what does that mean for the energy, Chinese, uh, you know, funding of the global energy transition. And so we had a data set of 18,000 projects from ADA's GCDF 3.0 data set, the Global Chinese Development Finance data set. And we wanted to figure out for our own purposes, sort of how many of these could classify as green, so solar, wind, hydro, nuclear. Again, these are somewhat subjective, and we'll go into that later. Brown, so coal, oil, fossil fuels. Gray, mixed, indirect, and neutral, just non-energy related, don't have anything to do. And the deal is that, like, to answer sort of the policy questions we wanted to answer, we had to figure out, like, how did we quantify green lending? And there were some existing data sets that allowed you to do this, but they were mostly focused on, I mean, they're great data sets, from Boston University and from the World Resources Institute. They have data sets about, power financing that are quite good, but they're limited in terms of the creditors and in terms of the fact that they only deal with power projects. And we're an ambitious project, and we had a limited resource, limited budget. It was two of us, and this is not my day job. I do this because I find it pretty interesting. So here we wind up using, the API approach. So, we've already learned about, using this chat interface and, one document at a time and all of this. And here we're moving on to something that's, programmatically using an API where you're able to process thousands, and you need to be able to do this either in Python or R. In terms of that, I'd say that, like, most of the API things for the LLMs are, Python is probably the dominant language for it, but I'd say that there's a growing R ecosystem that's quite good as well. And in general, the tooling is just becoming better and better quickly. So in terms of our project, to go back to what I talked about right at the beginning, there's a scale mathematics, and this is something that I found to be really powerful. Manual classification, and this is just doing back of the envelope, saying that it's 5 minutes per project. It would take 1,500 hours, and you say you're paying, undergraduate research assistants $15 an hour, which is frankly probably lowballing it. That would cost $22,500. Our approach, using the API, which we used DeepSeek v3, which is a Chinese LLM, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. It took 15 hours and it cost $1.58. I was absolutely floored at the end of it. And it was 100 times faster and 14,000 times cheaper. And so it's like, just think about sort of what the abilities here are. And so I think I can hear you thinking, but how do we know that this is correct? And that's really what we get to, and that's what I'm going to try to talk about here in part. But first, one of the other advantages of using LLMs for sort of large-scale classification projects like this is the context beats keywords. So the way that I did this in the first draft of our paper is I used regular expressions, which is basically a keyword search. And the problem with the keyword search is it doesn't understand the context that it's in. It could read something like this: 500 megawatt solar plant with backup diesel generator. As far as we were concerned, and we had a very detailed prompt that went into lots and lots of detail about what exactly we meant by each of these classifications, which I think I'll talk about in a moment. Um, it's basically like, yeah, if it's a backup generator, that's still a green project in our context. And so here, instead of saying, okay, we saw diesel, uh, you know, it's going to read the entire thing and sort of read the entire context and identify it as green, whereas it might have been misclassified otherwise. And so this is, I think, really the jagged frontier in action, and something where you say, like, actually, this has a lot of advantages over just using keyword searches or regular expressions, which was sort of the benchmark that we had, because that was the only thing that was going to be possible for us, because, spending $23,000 on it was not going to be possible for us. Um, and so I won't go through all of the code because this workshop is meant for people who aren't necessarily coders now. Maybe you're somebody that has some coding ability. Maybe you work with other people that do. But the idea here, I think, is to get more of a narrative sense of what we did and how we did it, so you can understand if this is a sort of thing that you might want to approach for some of your projects. Um, First is just taking a really small sample of them and testing it out. So we did this, in testing out, using 10 examples, or less, to sort of figure out, like, does your prompt work? Does all the mechanics of your coding work? All of this sort of stuff. And my colleague, my co-author and I went back and forth and iterated on the prompt, because sometimes we saw that it was not necessarily processing observations the way that we would want them to do it, or we would want it to do it. And so we went back and, added more clarity, added other sorts of things. And once we had that, I tried tried running 100, because we wanted to know, did our logging, there's a lot of background here that I will skip over, but, built logging and caching and all this other sort of fun stuff, and wanted to know that it would work with 100 examples. And then we did validation with 300 examples. And then after we did that, and I'll explain the validation in a moment, then we proceeded on to all 18,000 projects, so the full scale of it. Once we understood, okay, did we actually trust the outputs? What was the cost going to be? All of this other stuff. But the basic key insight is to start really small, validate early, and then you're going to be able to scale more confidently and know that you're going to get good outputs that you can trust, and you're also not going to run up a bill that's insane. So validation is really the critical step here. And this is where, when I looked at this, kind of going into this project, I looked around and figured out, like, is there a way that, are there best practices that people use? And what I found is that there were some, but they weren't particularly compelling, and there wasn't that much that had been written on this. And so I think, we don't think that our validation technique is like the be all end all of this, but we were like, look, let's try to make a good faith approach at trying to validate it that sort of, winds up being something that is both pragmatic in terms of the resource base that we have available, but also makes it so that, people can actually trust our results, and then publish that so that people can build on it. So we published a detailed, I can show you here, a detailed methodological note that's, I don't know, 27 pages long, that goes through, goes through all of, what we did, in terms of our methodology. It also gives the full prompt. We also wound up, publishing a GitHub repository, with all of our code, so that other people can hopefully build upon it. But so here's what the approach was generally, was first, so at this we validated with 300 examples. And we did wind up choosing, because most are going to just not have any sort of energy transition. It's an imbalanced data set. So we did choose sectors that we thought we would have more energy transition related projects in the first place, so that it wasn't just all not neutral projects. And we chose 300 random projects amongst those, and then the first thing that we did is we tested multiple models against each other. So we tested Claude 3.5 Sonnet. We tested ChatGPT 4o Mini. So both of those are from Frontier Labs. We tested Llama 3.3. So that's one of the ones from Meta. That's an open source model that I actually ran on this fine, very beefy Mac Mini that I'm recording this webinar on. And, just because I like the idea that we could do this, using, open source models, and, maybe we'd be able to put it in a Docker container and make it totally reproducible. There are these challenges that we have because these other models, they change all the time. So it's not going to be totally reproducible. So we ran these against each other, so all of them, gave them the same prompts and sort of then looked at what their answers were. And we looked at the, inter-rater reliability. And what we found was basically that, they agreed with each other a lot about what were green projects and neutral projects, a bit less about brown and gray projects, which meant for us in part that we wound up, focusing more on the green projects, which ultimately was what we cared about in the first place. But basically that we knew that we had slightly less, these were a little bit more ambiguous. And I think in the next portion, my co-author and I went through and we rated each of these projects ourselves, as human beings. And then we looked at, what was the agreement between the best, the best models and ourselves, and it was quite high, so it was 91.8% agreement, between DeepSeek v3 and our judgment of what these different things are. So all of this is in the methodology that's published. But yeah, I think that one thing is again, it was really drawn towards using, open source models and all of this. And we tried using that Llama one and it just was terrible. It was really, really bad. It would call coal projects green, which is just absolutely against like what the, what the prompt was telling it to, and sort of common sense. And so, if you look at this, well, I know this is too small to see, you see that this top line is a very different color, which is basically that all of these, that there's very low sort of correlation between what the Llama, that small local model did and these other bigger models. And we just found that it was bad. And so ultimately we wound up using DeepSeek v3. I don't know that I have this here, but so let me just talk about this very briefly. We also just wound up looking through and seeing exactly, like we looked at the cost, the amount of time it took, and a variety of other things. And the local model would have taken 2 weeks to run, and it made my Mac Mini very hot. I had to put a fan on it and leave it running overnight. and so yeah, we learned that it wasn't that good. DeepSeek V3 is technically an open source model. It's run by a Chinese lab, and you can both, you know, run it yourself, but you have to run it like in Modal or AWS or in some sort of cloud service, which takes, a decent amount of technical sort of DevOps skills to do. So if running things in clouds does not sound like your cup of tea, then don't think about doing it. And that ultimately, like we wound up using their API, and it was great, minus something that I think I will put later about content moderation. um, so what we discovered here is, we discovered that like no, there at least our data set, admittedly, is because we wanted to look at these co-financing relationships. We were using the aid data set, and it ends in 2021, and a lot has happened since 2021. So I think that's a limitation here, but basically, what we were able to do is sort of quantify like how much green lending has happened, which is basically not so much. You see a drop off of quote unquote brown lending, and a lot of this is all either very large um, petroleum related investments and or coal plants. So that's a lot of what the sort of brown ones are. But you don't see any sort of real pickup. A lot of this green BRI stuff, even in that period, it really doesn't sort of pick up. And so obviously it'll be very interesting to see what this says going forward. That there's quite possibly the future isn't the same as the past. And in the paper, we also look at a lot of other data sources as well to sort of supplement this. But it also allowed us to see like, okay, what was it that, what was it that they were funding? And that basically it was mostly hydro and nuclear in terms of quote unquote green projects. And so I guess this gets to something else, is that like, that's a very subjective thing. And the part of the idea of putting all of our work on GitHub and other stuff like this is that like if other people want to define green lending in a different way, they can run they can run they can run it with their own definition. And this is only really possible through scale. So I think the sort of meta picture of like, why does this matter, is that there's a lot of patterns that are invisible in small samples or just going through it by hand that you can see and that are very policy relevant that you're able to get when you can do things at scale, and at a scale that the LLMs really facilitate. So I think that the lessons for research here are partially, start where you're at. Web interfaces are going to be powerful for a lot of your tasks. Think about scale. What questions could you ask with unlimited processing? Validation is everything. Build it into what you're doing right from the start, and then share your methods. We're all going to benefit from transparency. It's like I don't think anything that I've done here is the best way that it can be done, but hopefully this allows you to build upon it. And that good enough is better than perfect. I think going back to this is 92% accuracy. I we'll just go and say that like I've done a lot of classifying. I've spent many hours looking through Chinese loan documents and doing this other stuff, and it is absolutely, it blows your mind with how boring it can be after 6 hours, 8 hours, and imagine if you're doing that for an extended period of time. And imagine you're 18 to 22 years old and you're doing that. Like, do you think that you're not also watching TikTok or doing something else? Like, I think sometimes, this isn't to say that there aren't many challenges with LLMs, but I think that human coding, as a gold standard is like, if you think that 18 to 22-year-olds doing this is the gold standard, like you guys are just much more responsible than I was when I was 18 to 22. It's like um, I would say that AP, LLMs don't stay out till 4 in the morning. So okay, um, from the workshop to practice, mental models, you have the jagged frontier, you have a collaborative approach, you have these low-hanging fruit, you have three tools, and then now you understand, what you can do when you want to scale and sort of like at least a little bit about what that is all about. For any of you that are much more interested in the API stuff, I could say a lot more, but I'm trying to keep this to 2 hours. I think I'm in about 2 hours right now. So let's just get started. I think you can take what you learned today and continue to make this, the sort of basis of what you're doing. And I think that like anything else, it's like you're going to learn where that jagged frontier is because you do this a lot, and because you, try it out and make it work. And so, yeah, create other gems or projects or whatever. Try it for coding assistance. Upload, a document collection to Notebook LM and, talk with other people. Ask them what they're doing. Share your best practices with people that you trust. And give it a try. Put it in the comments. I mean, you guys can see this is going to be my first YouTube video up here, and it's clearly not, polished, but share your successes in the comments. So in terms of going deeper and resources here, here's the reference book. Here is this one useful thing is Ethan Mollick's blog. I find it to be really useful. I've found his other papers and his book called Co-Intelligence to be quite useful, and I think it's really informed a lot of the way that I think about using LLMs in my work. The ODI methodology for the paper that I spoke of, and yeah, share what works and what doesn't. And I think just the final thoughts before we log off, and I'm oh my God, I almost made it exactly 2 hours. Start small, always validate, use AI for routine tasks. Use it for what you want to use it. If you enjoy something, like don't use it for that. Like, you're a human being, you have agency. But like routine tasks that are boring, use it to help you respond to poorly worded emails. Use it to fix your refrigerator. Try it out. Keep your critical thinking. Like, this is not an excuse to give up your critical thinking. It's an excuse to be able to use it more because you are going to automate the bullshit. Share your learnings with other people, and just remember what the opportunity is here. More ambitious research while maintaining rigor. And you now have tools, and while the specific technical tools that we talk about today are going to be, will clearly be outdated, the second you watch this. I think that a lot of the ways of thinking about it and the ways of approaching it, will last. So I hope that you, get some use out of them and it helps you on your journey. Yeah, so thank you. Your skepticism is an asset. Keep it. Your expertise is irreplaceable. And the whole idea here is just to amplify that. And yeah, please stay in touch.